This is Chris Evans from Architecting IT, and today I'm joined by Thomas Bryant from Commvault. Thomas, great to see you.
Thanks for having me on the show. I'm really glad to be here today.
Looking forward to it. So we're going to talk about something that I think is probably on everybody's mind in one way or another, and that's the idea of ransomware. But we're going to talk about it in context with a platform that you released towards the end of last year. Do you want to just give people a quick overview about what that is, and then we can dive into some more detail?
Yeah, so the capability that we launched back in November of last year is a thing called Cleanroom Recovery. So it's part of Commvault Cloud's platform for data resilience and for data protection. And the whole idea really centers around the idea of testing. And so if you think about disaster recovery, we've been doing that for quite a long time, and people have been testing that. But this idea of cyber recovery and being able to test in the cases of a malware or ransomware attack or just malicious hackers in general, it's kind of a new area for a lot of people. And so they're trying to figure out, how do I test that? And so that's why we came up with Cleanroom, is to give people a place that they can start to test and then move all the way up, much like DR, and get to full testing and recoverability.
Excellent. So we're going to go into the detail of that in a second. Yeah. Before we go into that sort of deep dive, why don't you tell us what you do for the company? Because that would be really, I think, helpful for everybody to understand.
Yeah. So I've been at Commvault for almost 2 years now. And so I'm one of the directors of product marketing. And so I work as part of a team for our overall portfolio. And that includes things like partner marketing, competitive intelligence, technical marketing, all the usual things that you think of. And some of the things that you don't maybe, like we're also very heavily involved in things like demo creation and some of the more fun things like podcasts.
Absolutely. So you're going to be our expert on this one. Absolutely. Let's start by talking about ransomware in general, though, because, you look back across, I don't know, the last 4 or 5 years, maybe a bit longer, and ransomware was sort of discussed. And then, in the last few years, it's really become a big issue for people. It seems to have got to the point where almost a day doesn't go by where you don't hear about somebody who's got a ransomware problem.
Yeah, I mean, every day it's a new attacker, it's a new threat. And, the saying goes that is part of like information security and SecOps, you have to be right 100% of the time. The attackers only need to be right once. Right. And so they're constantly attacking people. We've seen just an explosion in ransomware attacks. There's ransomware as a service now offerings. They have full help desks and IT to help you crack into companies and steal data and do bad things. So it's quite an interesting time to be alive, and one that can be very stressful for folks in IT.
I think from my perspective, I see a number of different things. First of all, there's obviously a big reputational thing if you don't have a way to deal with ransomware, but there potentially could be a huge cost for your company if you can't recover the data. If you can't get stuff back and you're down for any length of time, there's both a reputational thing and there's both a cost thing. So people might not think, ransomware is going to be a big deal for them, but the day that it does hit and the day that they see the cost of what it takes to get back, I think then you start realizing actually there's quite a significant impact on your business, and you really do need to think about this now.
Yeah, I mean, you look at all of the folks that have been attacked. You can look at Las Vegas, right? The reputational damage that it did on top of the monetary damages. And then you even find out after the fact that some of the other folks, like in Las Vegas, there was another casino that was actually hit as well, and they paid the ransom. And, it's fascinating the way that people are being attacked and what it's doing to their business. And yes, there's a monetary side, but yeah, to your point, that reputational damage can be greater in some cases. Even if you look at some of the more recent attacks than that, it can really damage your brand and how people think about you. And especially in today's modern age where you have so many choices of different platforms and services you can leverage, it's really easy to move from one to another. It's not as sticky as it used to be. And people are making switches because those that are being attacked and causing issues, people don't want to have their data there. They don't want to have yet another thing that they have to register for identity protection.
Okay, one last question in this area then, and I think this is quite an important one. if you look at the responsibility within the company, say the CISO or other areas who are responsible for this sort of protecting against ransomware, what is the responsibility on those people now? And how is the legal aspect of this changed, or has it always been a problem? Have companies had to think about the legality of who looks after this and what they've done to make sure they've got protection in this area?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of things we can unpack there. I mean, one of the interesting ones is like from a statutory standpoint, different regions like Europe are different than the US. For example, here in the US, there is no legal ramification of paying a ransom. Folks like the FBI and NSA and other groups, they recommend that you do not pay the ransom, but there's no like recourse if they do. And we see that, people do sometimes trust the bad guys, and the bad guys will help them get their data back because they also are trying to run a business. But it's scary, the ramifications that come along with it. And I think what we're seeing and what we're hearing from customers and folks in the field is that there's been that disconnect, sort of like when back in DR world, when it was like IT and like the business apps people. Now it's like SecOps and IT ops in terms of security has traditionally looked at building bigger moats, higher walls, preventing people from coming in. But when they get in and attack, they kind of then turn it over to IT and say, hey, okay, now do the recovery. And they're realizing that they need to be more involved in that side, and vice versa. IT is coming in at the end of this and being told, hey, you need to go recover petabytes, exabytes of data. Good luck. What data do I recover? What's clean? I don't know because they don't have the tools. So I think it's an interesting time because I see a lot and we see a lot of these kind of groups coming together more, which is a good thing. I think anytime you can break down some of those walls and those silos is a beneficial thing. But people now have that impetus because there's attacks every day, every week.
Okay, before we go on a bit further, when I was doing some thinking about this, one of the things that sort of sprung to mind is, and we're going to dive into the differences between DR and ransomware recovery in a second, but one of the things I looked at this and thought, well, people already back up systems, people already have protection for their data, why do we need to think about ransomware differently? And it made me think actually that there are some interesting assumptions made when we do DR. And one big example of that is that we assume when we do DR that our backups are secure, they're safe, they're valid, and they haven't been compromised. So it strikes me as we start to go into the discussion about this, that there's a very big difference between the way that we recover from a ransomware attack and the way we recover from, say, a disaster recovery incident. And we start to have to think about the way we set our stuff up in order to do this differently. So I just wanted to start to dig into that and, discuss with you about what you see in terms of the differences between the two.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the principles work in either place, right? There needs to be lots of communication. There should be lots of testing and lots of preparation and business side work that needs to be done in terms of, what are my tier 1 workloads? What are my tier 2 workloads? What do I really need to have? What are my application dependencies, right? A lot of people are like, oh, hey, in DR, we're just flipping a switch and everything comes back up. In cyber recovery, when we're trying to recover from ransomware, we're probably going to try to build things back up in an isolated environment, which means I have networking concerns, power cooling, all the other things. Plus, then I have to figure out, well, okay, you can't just bring a SQL server back in. You need authentication. You're probably going to need network services like DNS, maybe DHCP. Are all your VLANs there? All the other fun things that you're not used to necessarily changing in an isolated environment. So yeah, disaster is pretty well. I think it's pretty well understood across in the market, but cyber recovery is still something that's new because you said it best. If you don't know what data is good, then it's really hard to recover. Disaster, you're kind of assuming that all your data is good and I can just go with my latest copy. In a cyber attack, that bad malicious data or actor, they could have been in your environment. In some cases, we see dwell time of over 200 days. Do you have backups that can go that far back? How do you cleanse them and quarantine files? It's a daunting task. But people are, now that their attacks are growing in frequency and pervasiveness, people are coming out and trying to figure out, what do I need to do? They're starting to prepare, which is good.
So let's just dig into what that really means and how we see sort of DR working and being different from ransomware. I think it's worth just digging into this in a bit more detail, because without sort of understanding this in enough detail, I don't think we can understand why the clean room concept becomes so useful. And here's a good way to think about it. So if I've built systems that do DR, and I replicate to another location, for example, if I've got loads of money and I can afford to have a secondary site, that secondary site is basically a faithful copy of the primary. So if my primary gets infected, fairly quickly my backup site is going to get infected. So that DR model of having a secondary site is immediately thrown out the window. That's one scenario. The second one, I think, is the one you've just mentioned, Thomas, and that's this idea that these malicious attackers could have been in my system for weeks or months. My backups going back for quite a long time could be compromised. And in actual fact, generally when I recover from a DR scenario, I assume that maybe the last backup's okay. If I have to go back more than one backup, then that's a real problem, because my data is now getting further and further out of accuracy in terms of its currentness with the current application.
Yeah.
But with a ransomware attack, I have absolutely no guarantee that any of my backups potentially are actually safe. So I'm in a very different set of scenarios that I would have been compared to a DR issue.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It's, when I think about DR, like you said, it's you can flip a switch, and because you're making that assumption in the cyber resilience world, in these cyber recovery things, what's my last known good copy of data? If you get into a situation like this, the last thing you want to be doing is doing a recovery. Oh, nope, it's still infected. Wipe that out. Let's do another one. Let's recover the one before that. That process in and of itself, you think, oh, well, that can't be that hard. Well, maybe it's not for, say, a small print server or file server. But if it's something that has petabytes of data, now you're waiting on, the laws of physics to be able to recover that data. And one of the things that kind of comes along with that is, when we build systems, I mean, when I used to be in the data center, right, we would build our systems, we would go through all our usual QA and UAT, and we'd move it into production. But that was then that's the easy part. Like, the application's easy to install. It's the years of data, the petabytes, the exabytes of data now that you have behind that becomes really hard. We've never planned, nobody ever really plans for the idea of, we need to do a full recovery of all of the data. Because we don't know what we can trust. And without thinking about that, if you go back, and I bet if a lot of folks look at their systems and they try to figure out, okay, how much throughput can my disks really handle, and how big are, like some of my databases, they may just find out that no matter what they do, it could take them days, weeks, months to recover those huge amounts of data. And so it becomes important to test. It becomes important to have things that can help you identify clean backups and clean data that you can recover. One way I tend to look at it is, you almost kind of, and I'm going to go old school for a second with transparencies. Like, if you remember, like the papers, like the transparency pieces, that's kind of what you almost want, is like, I want something that can get all of the latest and clean data. But if there's dirty stuff, if there's bad malicious code or whatever, I want you to go find files, or that file from an older backup that is clean. So I still want to have all the benefits of getting my latest and greatest data back, but I also need to make sure that I keep the data clean and sanitized.
So let's add one little piece to this, and you just mentioned something there that we haven't really touched on. In classic DR, for example, we have recovery time objective, we have recovery point objective. Now, in a ransomware attack, I see no reason why those sort of metrics shouldn't apply. I'd still want to know that in a ransomware attack, I could recover within a certain time and get the business back up again, because those numbers are still relevant. So you highlighted something really interesting when you said about it could take days or weeks or months to get your stuff back. So businesses aren't going to be happy if they get told, oh yeah, if it was DR, we could recover it really quickly. If it's a ransomware attack, sorry, it's going to take us months. So I think people will be looking to apply the same service level objectives onto a ransomware recovery process that they were applying to a DR process. And I don't see any reason why you shouldn't accept that.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're absolutely, in terms of, RTOs, RPOs. I think they're still applicable. I think there's probably going to be some new ones that'll come about, and I don't, I'm not going to speak for the industry, but what I almost kind of joke sometimes. It's like mean time to recovery in the existing world. In like DR, now it's almost kind of like mean time to revenue, right? I mean, a lot of companies are so focused on what do I need to do to get my revenue engine going again, right? If I'm a hotel, how do I make sure that people can check in? If I'm a casino, how do I make sure like my slot machines and things are working? I want to make sure everybody's getting paid, right? I mean, I would never want to have thousands of people coming after me because paychecks are late because of some ransomware attack, because that's a
Yeah.
big problem. But yeah, I mean, I think the same. Some of the same metrics are going to be applicable, but you have to kind of look at them slightly differently, I guess, because your recovery time objective is going to be very different if you're replicating data and it's good versus you're replicating data and I don't know when my last good data is. So I think it changes a bit. I think there are going to be some new metrics that will come along for the ride. And I think it's kind of on all of us to kind of figure out what are those metrics. So I think some of it's a little early days, but I think that's a good thing too, right? It gives us an opportunity to try to come up with some new ideas and new ways to do this.
Well, I think it's also a good measure, from my independent side of things. I also think it's a good measure of how to look at a vendor. So if I've got a vendor who's helping me recover from a ransomware attack, I think I'd like to understand that vendor had technology that would do that quicker for me than, say, another vendor. And I'd also like a degree of assurance, shall we say, that I've bought technology that I know can get that stuff back for me within a period of time. That might not be the RTO and RPO for a standard DR recovery, but it's certainly something I can take to the board and say, look, we've put this solution in place, and it gives us a degree of recovery time that we can put our faith in. And I think that's really important. So let's go on and talk about what a clean room actually is. And why don't you just set the scene for people and explain what a clean room really is, what it actually means, and what are sort of the aspects of it.
Yeah. So I worked in the pharmaceutical industry for a number of years. So it's like really near to me. But like if you think about a clean room, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's a room that is designed to be clean, so free of dust and contaminants. It's a place that you can put things that you want to keep isolated and away from everything else for whatever reason. And in our case, when I think of a clean room, really what it is it's a isolated environment. So some people use the term IRE, or isolated recovery environment, as well. Clean room, just it evokes a visual, I think, better than the term IRE. But it's a place where you can recover your data into, and you can test it, you can bring it in for production, do whatever you need to do, but it's away from the rest of your environment. And that's really important when we think about cyber recovery, because nowadays, whether it's these malicious groups or state-sponsored actors, they're getting into things like the firmware, they're getting into BIOSes, they're getting into printers, all sorts of different devices, and causing damage. And they're reinfecting because you clean stuff and you forget, oh, hey, I probably should check the firmware on my printer. Nobody's thinking about that. So a clean room really just gives you a place that is isolated away. It's guaranteed to be clean. In our case, like what we're doing is we're building essentially a brand new Azure tenant for customers that they can then put all of their data into, because now it's going to be built right off the bat. Nobody else has access to it. And more importantly, the bad guys can't go in there and do things.
So would it be right to think of it as a one-way type system? So for instance, you can move applications and recover stuff into it, but you necessarily can't move stuff out, because it sounds to me like you might use it not only for testing of data that you've recovered that might be safe, but you might want to isolate data that you're recovering that you don't know whether it's safe. Mm-hmm. So you wouldn't want to necessarily allow stuff to leak out, but you want to be able to put stuff in. So would you see it as a one-way thing, or is there a scenario to allow two-way traffic there?
Both ways, absolutely. It just depends on the scenario. So if I'm thinking about testing, yes, I want it to be an isolated environment. I don't want anything to leak out. And I certainly don't want the bad actors to be able to get in. But if I'm doing that, let's say I'm doing an actual recovery, right? I'm going to want at some point, I'm going to bring up my services and I'm going to want to swing that over into production. So yes, we need to be able to have the ability to go in there and adjust things like VLANs and swing those over so that you can connect to it to the outside world once you've made sure that it's clean. But if you're doing forensic analysis, right? So let's say you've got maybe some cyber insurance and they're like, hey, we want to see how they got in. We want to look at some of those systems. Yeah, you definitely don't want any of that getting out to the outside world. So there's definitely the need for it to be isolated to begin with. But I think longer term then is as people get comfortable with the idea of using a clean room and you test it, you're going to naturally get to that point where at some point you want to like, hey, I'm going to use this for my production failover. And then I can, fail back once I've cleaned my primary site and bring it back on-prem if they want.
Okay, so would you therefore build isolated credentials authorization environments within that? So for instance, if you're using Active Directory, would you expect that people would build an entirely brand new Active Directory environment or recover their existing one into that as part of that? So literally everything is unique, Active Directory downwards is unique to that environment.
I think it's going to depend on what the customer wants to do. I mean, and what their recovery time objectives are. There's kind of that concept of recovering versus like rebuilding and repaving. Like if you think about repaving, you already have like a parking lot. All we're doing is putting a new layer on top of it. And that's sort of like in the application world, kind of like what you said, right? I build up a new AD environment and then I lay all my users and all my GPOs and everything into it. That's certainly an option, and some customers do go down that route, but that takes time and it then can make things more complicated, right? You've got all the computers that are associated with a domain and whatnot. So that can become a good thing and a bad thing because there's pros and cons on both sides. So I think customers and folks are kind of looking at what's best for their scenario. But what I think is interesting that I'm finding is customers aren't just building one clean room, right? They're going to build one almost in some cases per application because I'm going to put an Active Directory, it's isolated. So there's no connectivity to the outside world, no DNS, no Active Directory, no LDAP, whatever. They're going to build that up. They're going to put an LDAP server in there, AD. Maybe they do tie it to Entra. I don't know. But then they build up that application. And when that application is good, then they swing over the VLANs and the VXNets. And then they do the next one, or they're running in parallel. And now I've got another isolated environment. And now when I'm ready, I swing that one over. But by doing it that way, you also avoid any cross-contamination, right? So if application one still has some malicious code and you miss it for whatever reason, you don't want application 2, 3, 4, 5 to go down because now they're all in the same tenant. They all got infected and I have the same problem again. So I think it's an interesting time in that people are starting to look at it like, no, it's not quite the same as DR where I just recover everything. I actually kind of need like bespoke clean rooms for each of the applications I'm trying to recover. But at the same time, some people are just doing, hey, I'm just going to build one environment, put all my networking and other services I need, and then I'll just build up all the apps that I need and I'll figure it out as I go. And if it doesn't work, they can just blow it away. I mean, they can just turn it down, delete the tenant, and away goes the data.
Okay, so what would you be using it for then in that scenario? So you've highlighted two scenarios there, which I think are quite interesting. One that you might test a specific application, and one that you might test everything. So does that mean you might use the clean room to validate that, say, for example, the last backup that you took of an application is valid? Or would you be using this when a ransomware attack has happened to recover and then clean that data before you put it back into production? Or is it a combination of all of those things?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of all those things. I think the first piece is people need to get the rigor and test. You need the muscle memory of doing these testing. I mean, when I got into IT a long time ago, DR was still kind of new when I got into it. And for me, it was kind of something like, whoa, this is a problem. And we had to test, and we found things that didn't work, and we fixed it, and we tested again, and we fixed it, and we tested again. But yes, I think in cyber recovery, that's the same sort of thing. Is people need to start testing, and if because you can't fail over if you've never tested, right? You can try, but it probably isn't going to be very successful. And actually, we've done some. We reached out to over 1,000 different IT and security professionals. We did a survey recently about this sort of thing, like, hey, when you have an attack, how quickly can you recover? And it's interesting because those that do test and those that have been through an incident before are like 40% faster to recover because they've gone through that testing, because they know what things they're going to run into, and they built a plan and they have that resiliency piece around it, so they know how to recover.
Okay, so we're going to dig into your particular product in a second, but one, I guess one scenario should just come to mind when you mentioned about customers who are already testing, and that's that whole idea of cost. So one of the things that DR is always a bit of a challenge for is that DR is quite expensive. You know, if you've got masses of money, you tend to look at it and say, well, my business, if I'm a bank, means I need to have failover equipment so I can recover everything immediately.
Yeah.
Now, there might be other scenarios where you say, well, I don't really want to build DR for that environment in its entirety, but I will recover it to maybe the cloud because that application is not that important.
Yeah.
In the ransomware scenario, testing continuously, I guess, could become quite expensive. So the way that you implement the clean room is going to have to be done in a way that makes this cost effective, surely.
Absolutely. I mean, when we go to the cloud, you know, the original premise was we were going to save all kinds of money and the cloud's cheaper and whatnot. And in some cases that's true, but it can get very expensive very quickly, especially if you're using a lot of compute resources. And so one of the benefits, you know, of our architecture at Commvault is because of the way that our platform's architected, when you're not doing a test, the cost is pretty much minimal. It's basically whatever data you want to store up in an isolated area. So we use a thing, it's called Air Gap Protect. And what that does is it allows us to keep a copy of your data in immutable air gap storage in the cloud that you can then put into the clean room. And so essentially, if you think about when I'm not doing if I'm just replicating that data up there, it's just data that's going into the cloud. So you don't have to worry about egress fees. You're not worrying about compute cycles that are expensive. It's just, you know, essentially block storage or object storage. When you do the test, when you're ready and you're ready to do a test or do a failover or move to production, whatever it may be that you're doing forensics, that's when the compute comes in. And that's when you can start to figure out, all right, how often do I need to test? What's that cost going to be? Because there is going to be a cost, right? Now, all of a sudden you're spinning up, you know, maybe it's some, you know, Azure SQL servers, right? All of a sudden I'm spinning those up. There's going to be a cost. I'm going to test with that. I'm going to bring my data in. Oh, nope, things failed. I'm going to tear it all down and do it again, right? And so there's going to be a people cost. There's going to be a technology cost that comes along with that. But I think one of the benefits that we have with our architecture is because of the way that we decouple our data plane from the compute and the control allows us to make that really cost effective. Because you're right, it's just, you know, nobody, save for really large companies, has a clean room. I mean, big companies may have some DR, but they probably don't even have a clean room, right? That means separate network equipment, separate storage devices, compute. People don't spend money on that kind of stuff anymore. And so if you're going to do something like this, it can't break the bank and it sure can't cost you $30 million.
Yeah, perfect. So let's talk about your technology then. Take us through exactly what it is, how it works. And I think if you can explain it in terms of the context of some of the things you just talked about there. Yeah. So, you know, where this is actually going to be running, how actually instance it, how it spins up, where does it take the data from, all that sort of stuff. I think it'd be really important to go through.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the base layer I'll start with is like the control plane, right? So Commvault Cloud, we have a control plane that you can run in different places. Depending upon what you want as a customer. So you can run it on-prem as downloadable software. We have hyper-converged appliances that you can use if you want something a bit more turnkey. You don't want to have to source hardware and whatnot. Or we run as a SaaS service. So you can use us as a kind of backup as a service, if you will. I think this is the term that's used a lot. And that control plane is isolated away from the data. So I'll pick on SaaS because it's easy. Let's say you're using Commvault Cloud in a SaaS model. And so you're protecting workloads maybe that are on-prem. I don't want to have to deal with, patching my data protection platform and cyber resilience. So I'm going to use the SaaS. I'm backing up data and I'm keeping a copy on-prem. Hopefully you're following kind of that 3-2-1-1 where you've got 3 copies of data, 2 different medias, one's offsite and immutable. One of those copies, an immutable copy for us, can be up in Air Gap Protect. So Air Gap Protect is a component of Commvault Cloud that allows you to take a copy of the data that you have on-prem, or it could be SaaS data too, right? Or from an appliance, and copies it into an area in our tenant that we keep secure for you, that's air-gapped, virtually air-gapped, that you could then use that data to recover from. Now, why does that matter? Well, the control plane being separate from the data plane is important because that control plane doesn't have to be where the data is. So if I'm running SaaS, well, you're not worrying about it anyways. But if you're on-prem, let's say you're a software customer and your whole on-prem environment's now dead. I don't know what data to trust. Now my backup data, my control plane might be bad. I don't know if I can use that. Well, the beauty of Cleanroom is that we actually protect the control plane as well. So we actually can take copies of your control plane. So that's all like the indexing and all the keys and all the stuff that makes up Commvault Cloud. And we keep copies of that, again, in an immutable area so that when you need to spin it up, you don't even have to think about it. Like you can go into Commvault Cloud and just click a button and say, I want to recover my control plane. It comes up in our environment. It gives you a brand new username and password to log in and allows you to do recovery tasks. It's not a destructive thing, right? I'm not going to give you keys because you could be a bad actor who's trying to do a test here and go in and destroy things. So it's built on the fly and allows you to get back in and then get into a copy of your data. So it's important that you have a copy somewhere else, and that's what Air Gap Protect does for us. Keeps you an immutable copy of that data in the cloud. And then we protect the control plane so that you can recover. Now, once you've got the control plane back and you've got the data, you can recover. Well, if that data is in the cloud, bringing that back on-prem might take a while, right? I don't know how much data you've got. Is it petabytes, exabytes? That could take a while. Wouldn't it be nice if we could just leverage the power of the cloud and use it there? And that's exactly what Cleanroom does. It builds up a brand new tenant in Azure. It allows them to then push the data into that tenant, and you can do testing. We have tools and capabilities within our platform that can tell you, hey, this is the last known good copy of your data. These pieces of data look malicious. And we can essentially do kind of that transparency thing where you kind of layer up the backups to find the good data, and it will only pull in the good data, the things that are clean, and it will just ignore that and find the last known good copy of that infected file or folder or whatnot. So there's a lot of power that Cleanroom can bring for customers to be able to recover that in an isolated environment. So I'll pause there for a second.
Yeah, okay. So but basically what you're building is you're building me an environment in Microsoft Azure. You're doing all the networking, you're doing all the security around that to create an isolated tenant that allows me to take my data, which is in your platform somewhere else, hopefully, already secured and ready to go. And you're going to bring it into that environment for me in a controlled manner, which allows me to bring my apps back up. Yeah. And then I can go and look at those apps and say, do they look secure? Am I happy with them?
Yeah, absolutely. And then it's your Azure tenant at the end of the day too. So if you want to go and then swing over the VLANs and attach it to your network, go for it. You have full control and you can do whatever you need because it is at the end of the day the customer's tenant at that point. We're just hosting the control plane for them and making sure that they have availability to the data. And I think the other piece that's important is the automation then that comes with it, because you don't want to be doing this the first time manually, right? You want to find what doesn't work and ruthlessly automate everything you can. And so having that automation framework in there to help you automate all of the things is kind of a critical piece in my mind as well.
So that's, I think, quite an important one to think about, because when you, for instance, if you do DR, anybody who's ever gone through a DR process and a recovery process will know that you have steps you go through, and you sit there and you say, okay, to build the system back up, you need to follow step X, Y, Z, build it with this image, recover it with this image. So you really do need to have automation built into a process that allows you to recover this. So it sounds like there's a little bit of work to get that lined up properly, but I'm guessing that becomes a repeatable task you can reuse for the next time.
Absolutely. I mean, you don't know what you don't know until, people joke about like the Mike Tyson quote of like everybody, has a plan until they get punched in the teeth. It's so true. You know, until it actually happens, you don't know. And so I think that's why I talk a lot about testing, and we talk a lot about testing, is you have to test this. You do not know what's going to happen until you do it. You're going to find that different things, whether it's authentication works slightly different, or your apps behave a little bit different because they're in the cloud. It's different, right? You might be coming from another piece here, right? You might be coming from, let's say, an on-prem vSphere environment, and now when we're recovering these VMs, we're recovering them as Azure VMs. And so that means that there's going to be a little bit of difference there. And until you know what that is and you've tested it, you can't plan accordingly. But yeah, I think I don't know that cyber recovery is its own run book. I almost see it as kind of a continuation of what disaster recovery is. It just goes farther, because where DR kind of assumes that the data is good, now you're making the assumption that all the data is bad. And that's still a lot of the same steps, but just a bunch of new ones that we haven't maybe done before.
It sounds like a lot of the DR people are going to have to work together with the people who are doing ransomware recovery, or may already be the same people. So there is a certain amount of synergy between these two areas, I think. And if you're already involved in, say, doing DR, you're probably going to have a really good idea about the steps you need to perform to do a ransomware recovery. You may already be familiar with the idea of recovering your environments into a new Azure environment or AWS environment. So I would suspect that this won't be something new for a lot of people. It'll be more around those benefits around the whole clean protection and secure side that will be maybe a bit different that they have to look at. But generally, I would hope that people could look at it and say, okay, I understand how to do this. I just need to think about how my runbooks look in a slightly different way.
Yeah, I think the one thing that is the biggest difference in my mind is where DR, I don't know if this might sound weird, but like where DR, I used to do it in a silo. Like IT was responsible for everything. We made sure that things work. Now you really have to involve those other groups. You have to involve security, right? You're not necessarily the expert in malware. They may have different tooling that they want to bring in to scan through your clean room to make sure that it's clean, right? They may have different sets of tools than the IT operations people have. So I think the cross group collaboration is the biggest difference in my mind. But yeah, it's definitely an extension of what people are already doing. And I think if you take that mindset, it's not as daunting, because you don't want to start from scratch on everything. Take what you've got, what you've built up, the muscle memory and all of that automation and runbook, and make that kind of now, it's a fork in your decision criteria of, do I trust the data? No. Now what do I do? And so I think that's a different set of new things and new capabilities and new tools and process. But I also, selfishly, I think it's also a great personal thing in that it gives you an opportunity to expand your career too, because, I was a tape guy back in the day, and, people that just kind of did backup, we were kind of like, well, I don't know what I'm going to do. I mean, I guess I can just do backups forever. But like, this is a new area that people can even explore for career advancement, which I think is pretty neat, because there's so much we don't know, and there's still a lot to be done in terms of industry standardization and things, that it's really exciting space to be in. And that's why I'm here. I love what we do every day.
I've done a lot of DR. So I've done a lot of building DR plans, executing DR testing. Thankfully, not too much actual DR recovery, which is in a real world scenario, although I have done some. And I think I find this interesting because it's a totally new evolution And the reason I think it's different is because now I'm actually in a very different scenario about knowing what's good and what's bad. And I have to add in lots of new process that allows me to say, okay, this data might be good, it might be bad. I need to test it. I need to validate the recovery process a lot differently. So I think it's a whole new nuance, and it takes you on to a new level. So you're absolutely right that I think people who think that DR might actually not be that interesting. When you look at ransomware, it's a whole different ballgame, and it's that much more complex. Just to finish up on your platform itself, though, some obvious questions around things like scalability and cost. Can I scale this infinitely? Can I run multiple clean rooms at the same time? How are you going to charge me for this? I think those are going to be quite important questions for people.
Absolutely. So, I think from a scalability perspective, it will scale as well as the cloud will scale. Essentially, you could call it virtually limitless, right? We're using the scale of the cloud, and in this case, we're talking about Azure, to be able to bring resources back up. So as long as there are IO cycles there and compute, then you essentially can scale up and scale out. Another benefit of our architecture is that we are designed to scale both out and up, and we can recover that data very quickly. We have a thing called Cloud Burst Recovery. It's not like a product, it's just a capability of the platform that allows you to leverage like infrastructure as code to say, hey, I want to recover terabytes, petabytes of data as quickly as I can at the lowest cost. And in one case, we recently did a test with Cloud Burst Recovery, and I'm going to pick on AWS for a second. We did some recoveries in AWS, and we recovered 100 terabytes of data, and it cost 32 cents. 32 cents.
Okay.
That's pretty cheap. And by the way, we did it in like 15 minutes because we can leverage the power of the scale outness of the cloud. We can leverage our platform that can scale out like that. And in that case, I was actually bringing data from on-prem out to the cloud. So it was an air gap protect. But yeah, I mean, the other benefit of our platform too is that when we store the data, we store it in a data agnostic way from the platform that it came from. So like if it's a vSphere VM, that's fine. You want to bring it back into, as a vSphere VM, maybe up in like VMware services for Azure. You could do it that way. You can bring it back as an Azure VM, but we decouple that so that you can have that data portability, so that you can move that data without having to I don't want to have to recover the data somehow and do like a V to V or a P to V in the middle of doing a recovery. So the platform supports all of that for scale up and scale out. You can go as big as you want. And then as far as clean rooms, it's really up to the customer to decide how they want to architect it, whether they want just one clean room where they're going to do lots of things. I'm personally pretty risk averse. So if I was doing it, my thought process is more, I want to have a clean room for every application. Maybe there's some shared services. Maybe I have like a clean room that has just my, Active Directory and DNS and all my shared services that I know are clean, because you're going to need those for everything. And then I'll open that up to my individual clean rooms that I'm building up for each app. Because the worst thing that could happen, at least in my view, is like I get in there, I recover 15 or 20 apps, and now I get to the 21st app, and I made a mistake. There's dirty data, and now everything's infected again. So the idea of multiple kind of walled gardens or multiple clean rooms, it makes a lot of sense to me, but you can do it however you want. And then from a costing perspective, for us, because we're storing the data in an offline state in terms of like we're not using compute, it has a very affordable cost to it. So essentially what you're doing is you're paying a kind of like a per terabyte cost to store that data. And then we give you the ability to test that data multiple times throughout the year at no cost. So you can bring that back up. Now you're going to have to cover the cost of your own compute, right? I don't know how big if you all of a sudden you decide you need the biggest compute, we're not going to eat the cost on that. So you're going to decide what you want, you bring it up, you test it, and you tear it down. But we're not going to charge you extra per se for doing those tests. And that way you can get that muscle memory. You can get used to it. And again, without breaking the bank. And that's the other benefit of the cloud, right? Is that If I'm not using it, I'm not paying for it. If it's offline and it's just blocks on storage, it's pretty inexpensive. Compute is always the thing that tends to eat up the cost in the cloud the most. So having that flexibility in our platform to bring things back online only when you need it makes it really cost effective, because we really do want everyone to be able to test. It can't just be the big folks that are going out and doing tests. I mean, how do you deal with the smaller business, whether it's, folks in EMEA or the mom and pop store down the street that happens to have some vSphere in their environment, right? We want everyone to be able to do this because the criminals don't care who you are. They have no idea. They just want money. And whether you're a small business or a big business, they're going to come after you. And so, I think it's really important that if we are going to have something like this, it has to be really cost effective. And the other piece, even more than cost, it's got to be drop dead simple. It really has to be something that is easy for people to understand. This is what I want to protect. Great. I mark it. I say, these are the things that I care about. This is where I want it to be able to recover to. And that's kind of it, right? And then I start to do my test. Then I start to see what works. What didn't work, I fix that. I automate it. And then I do it again.
So it sounds like there's a certain degree of, the degree of access for everybody to be able to log in and use this is pretty high. And as you said, you could be a small business, you could be a larger business, and it made me think that even there could be third parties who decide to help customers test, and do this clean room testing for them. So really, it sounds to me like there's almost no excuse not to be looking at this technology, because your business is going to be too valuable, for you to lose. And if you're really, really heavily focused on IT, you're going to have to look at it and say, I need some solution. And it sounds like, this is going to be a very easy way to do it. Yeah. So we've talked about a huge amount of different aspects here, though. So let's just take a step back and think, if I'm a customer who's listened to this and watched what we've been saying and really would like to get into more detail, where can we point them on the Commvault website? Can they see demos? Can they try this out? What's available for them today?
Yeah, of course. So absolutely, you can go to commvault.com and you can go to Cleanroom Recovery. And there's I believe some videos out there. You can, there's some chat buttons, and you can request a demo, and we can absolutely take you through it. And again, we have trials available as well. So if let's say you want to, as easy as possible, right? You can go online, you can start up a trial of Commvault Cloud, and then we'll reach out to you and figure out what is it you're wanting to trial, and we can help you down that path of, even trialing and working with Cleanroom. So yeah, there's lots of materials out there. We've got some great reports about why you should consider a clean room, even if it's not a Commvault thing, but why it's important that you start to think about testing and cyber recovery and cyber resilience now, as opposed to when it's too late.
Yeah, I think a lot of businesses might be thinking, costs are difficult, and why would we need this? I genuinely think, after having this conversation, that any business really does need to think about how they protect their data in both, DR scenario and a ransomware recovery scenario. And that really does mean moving on to that next level and using something like a clean room. So I recommend everybody goes online and has a look. We'll share the details of links for this in the show notes, so people can go and have a look. But Thomas, this has been a great discussion. We talked through a lot of things. If you're watching this, go and have a look, follow those links, and obviously come back to us, I guess, if there's any questions. You and I'd be very happy to answer any questions that anybody may have. Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I'm active on LinkedIn. You can find me there. You can find me on most social media platforms, whichever you prefer as well. But yeah, thank you so much, Chris, for the time to talk today. This was fantastic. It's been really useful, Thomas, and I'm looking at it thinking I'm going to go off and have a look and see how I can use this technology in my business as well, because I think, having listened to it, it's really, really important to look at both DR and ransomware recovery, and this looks like a great solution. So for now, thanks for your time, and look forward to catching up soon. All right, cheers. Bye. Thanks.